So I think we'll get started. Hopefully I can see that lots of you are already clicking on the QR code. So there's a couple of different opportunities to interact in this session. Some of them are using this tech, 𝗕Vox. So you can contribute to the word cloud. And then once you're on 𝗕Vox, if you press the down arrow in the left-hand corner of your phone, there should be 3 questions that you can answer using the clipboard icon on the right-hand side. And then at any time throughout the session, you can share your thoughts, reflections, or questions using the speech bubble in the middle. And hopefully we'll have time to answer some questions. If you want your question answered, you can put an asterisk at the start, or if you just want to contribute a question, contribute a thought that can be just there as we're going towards the end of the session, you can do that. So my name is Sara Winkler-Reid, and I'm the chair of the committee who organised and ran the Association of Social Anthropologists in the UK, the ASA, the Anthropology Educates conference over the course of 9 months in 2022. And I'm joined here by 3 of our conference organising committee, Caroline Gatt, Elsayed, Abdelhamid, and Ingold. And we're going to speak to you this afternoon about why we wanted to organise this conference and some of the things that emerged from it. The aim of Anthropology Educates was to bring questions of learning and education and the role that anthropology plays in these to the fore. Contributors to the conference interrogated the many ways in which education, including anthropological education, perpetuates violence, exclusion, and privilege, and also explored the many possibilities and pathways of knowing and being that anthropological education can open up. And Dr. Williams' keynote last night was a powerful example of both the destructive and regenerative potential of education. So as we designed ASA 2022, we wanted to bring insights and understandings about learning and education, not just into the topic, but also into the structure of the conference. So because we were doing an online conference, we had the flexibility to experiment. And so we decided to space the conference out over a series of months. Our aim was to provide opportunities for sustained synchronous and asynchronous engagement between participants who were not sharing the same physical location. So as such, we decided on 5 studios, named to highlight them as meeting spaces of practice, collaboration, and creation. Each studio was a month long, with 2-hour live starting session, 1-hour live concluding session, and lots of different engagements and discussions in different mediums in between. So these included live workshops, uploaded documents, video recordings of activities and presentations, and also discussion boards that enabled time and space for discussion across the month. The 5 studios and their co-conveners are here listed behind me. And as I said, we've got Caroline, Elsayed, and Tim, who'll be speaking more about their studios in this session. So we're so pleased to be here today, talking to you and to be part of the RAI Anthropology and Education Conference. And again, the fantastic range of papers and panels and workshops here also interrogate and explore the actualities and potentialities of learning and education. And we really hope these conferences signal a growing recognition of the importance of bringing an explicit focus on learning and education into the heart of our discipline. So why learning and education? Well, I'm preaching to the choir here, but during my fieldwork in a London high school, I was blown away by the immense learning and educational achievements of the young people I spent time with, 15 to 16-year-olds preparing for their end-of-year General Certificate of Education national examinations. If there's any parents here who have just gone through the GCSE process, you're probably still recovering. It involves something like 30 exams, crazy. But the reason why the young people were such amazing learners was not because all of them, or in fact most of them, would excel in their exams. In the comprehensive school that I was doing my research in, there was a spectrum of orientations to formal schooling, ranging from active resistance, apathy, to intense commitment. But instead, it was because I had the privilege to observe firsthand the way young people create and maintain relationships, friendship groups, and a hierarchical social order through the sheer force of their actions. As I've explored in my recently published monograph, through talk, judgment, evaluation, feelings, bodies, peers actively and tenaciously shaped each other and themselves according to particular ideas of what it meant to be an acceptable person. In other words, they were involved in an intensity of peer learning and education practices in the process of growing up and successfully becoming particular kinds of adults. While these processes of peer learning and education were very effective, what was much more hit and miss was the official business of schooling. Education that was generally through the transmission of authorized static knowledge from adults to young people. However, narrow understandings of learning and education in terms of this transmission of authorized knowledge continue to underpin many understandings and practices of learning and education, including, as we'll be discussing today, anthropological education. So, organising ASA 2022 and working on the subsequent volume that emerged from this conference has given me much cause to reflect on the experience of learning and education, as well as building on my research. And learning involves many things and parts of ourselves, but in formal practices of higher education, the focus is often on just a few: thinking, writing, reading, listening. And conferences can also be a bit like this. So the first question we posed as you entered the room, and there's still time to answer this if you want, is just to briefly acknowledge that we are not just brains. So I'm interested to see what this one word about how you're feeling now is, and hopefully this will work, and we can see. But you also have it up, so let's have a look at this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this is kind of what we'd expect, right? It's tiring being at conferences. We're at the end of the day. Maybe you've been conscientious and gone to lots of panels. Curious, that's so great that that is up there. Overstimulated, stimulated, exhaustion, overfed on biscuits. Yeah, sleep deprived, exhausted again. Exhausted but inspired, I like that. Talkative, stimulated, cooked, chilled. So there's a whole variety of things going on here, caffeinated. Some people are feeling a bit overstimulated, some people are feeling exhausted. Caroline's gonna do an activity after this that's going to bring us back into our bodies, but we just wanted to recognize that we're not just brains consuming things. We wanted to think about all of us being here and just being more than just our brains. So again, this is going to be very familiar to most of you, I think. As I observed during my fieldwork, and as we can see pretty much everywhere we look, humans are amazing learners. Speaking, driving, hunting, knitting, to name just a few, learning what is required to be a particular kind of child or a particular kind of adult, all are complex, multi-step processes that take time to learn and are often supported by practices of education, explicit instruction, guidance, adjustment, and deliberation. Everywhere we turn, we can observe the processes and practices of learning and education, and only a small minority of these happen in formal education institutes, or, as I observed in my fieldwork, the learning that happens far exceeds the formal aims. And there is a wealth of anthropological research that focuses on learning processes, educational practices, both formal and informal, and educational institutions. And lots of you here today will be contributing to this research. So this research shows that learning is fundamentally social and is often part of other social processes. They're not explicitly designated as learning. That there is a huge variety in the settings and contexts of learning and education, who is involved in these processes, what kinds of knowledge, skills, and beliefs are shared and learned, and who is considered a learner. And that learning might involve explicit and deliberate direction and instruction, but can also often occur through observation and participation. So again, not very surprising conclusion, that learning and education are essential to being human, and there is a long and rich anthropological scholarship that explores this. However, despite sporadic calls over the last 40 years for these to be brought to the center of the discipline of anthropology, as Suzanne D. Bloom argued in 2019, these have yet to take. And if the anthropology of learning and education has been sidelined in the mainstream of the discipline, even less attention has been paid to anthropology as education. It was this that we particularly wanted to focus on in ASA 2022. So, do our practices of anthropological education match up to what we know about these through our research? I don't think so. So, despite all we know about the fundamentally social, embodied, situated, and emergent nature of learning and education, anthropological university education often proceeds according to narrow conventional modes that focus on the deficient individual learner, lacking knowledge, and the transmission of specific authorized and abstract knowledge. Tim, building on the work of John Dewey, has written about this as an understanding of education, primarily in terms of the transmission of information with the aim of transcribing pre-existing content from head to head. Similarly, Paulo Freire has called this banking education, with education imagined as an act of depositing in which students are depositories and the teacher is a depositor. Banking understandings of education continue to implicitly underpin many formal practices of higher education, including anthropological education. So classrooms and lecture theatres are conventionally spaces for the transmission of authorized knowledge. Teachers decide what students should learn, assign readings, give lectures, hope that students will be able to reproduce this knowledge in a form we find acceptable. And often this is followed by marking student assignments and feeling depressed that this process didn't really work, or bemoaning that students don't care. And while we encourage critical thinking, this is often within the parameters of acceptable knowledge already set. So as Simone Dennis, studio convener and member of the organising committee, argues, following her studio on student academic collaborations, even though teaching in higher education may take the form of a dialogue, students are gently guided towards the transformation of their understandings so it more closely replicates that of the teacher. In this unquestioned and implicit aim towards the propagation of sameness, there is often no room for student knowledges to disrupt the authorized knowledge. So these one-way transformational aims are at odds with influential currents in the discipline. In recent years, anthropologists have recognized the domination and erasure involved in subsuming other ways of being and knowing into their pre-existing frames, and have grappled through theoretical and empirical explorations and debates with how to hold space for and work generatively with difference. However, these insights have not always traveled into the practices of the classroom. So this isn't to suggest that there's no role for the teacher or for our existing anthropological knowledge. One of the powerful practices of anthropological education is to lead students beyond their experience, to understand there are many ways to live in the world, and to help them connect their experience to the experiences of others. Anthropological knowledge and education can help to make visible things that may be invisible to some students, such as the structuring power of race, racism, and coloniality. And anthropology has theoretical and empirical tools to help students engage in critical inquiry about the world, or as my friend often puts it, a Stanley knife to cut through the bullshit. And lots of these are the reasons why we became anthropologists in the first place, and we continue to love the discipline. And so this might involve an aim towards some dimensions of sameness. For example, a shared openness towards the world, commitment to critical inquiry, and respect for others. But if we succeed in making students like ourselves, we also succeed in reproducing all the problematic aspects of the academy. So this is a call for more explicit dialogue and reflection between ourselves as well as with our students about what kinds of sameness we want to aim for, to explore together what is being learned, including what's being learned in the institution as well as in our classrooms, and to bring explicit focus to the learning process. And it's also a call for allowing transformations in understanding and orientation to be mutual rather than unilateral, and for ensuring we hold space for difference. It's important to recognise that people will be differently positioned to make changes to their teaching. People are struggling with their workload, in precarious positions in the institution, worried about their jobs, under attack by their government for what they teach. And there's lots of good reasons why we can only do what we can do. But starting to talk and think about learning and teachings in forums such as this is at least a good first step of taking seriously 𝗕𝗰𝘂𝗰𝗁 wonderful insight that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. So I've experienced firsthand the surprising transformational potential of classrooms. Building from my fieldwork in school, I co-founded with Sarah Ralph Lane 𝗘𝗱𝘂𝗰𝗁 Northeast. And 𝗘𝗱𝘂𝗰 started from the recognition that girls are devalued in their everyday lives, and that transmission education that starts with deficit understandings of learners is implicated in this devaluation. At the same time, the pervasive processes of peer learning in school, as I said, are rarely recognised, and there's usually no space for girls to explore the complexity and intensity of their peer relations. So using the school classroom as a space of possibility, our aim was to create a conscious, supporting space of value where girls could explore the things they were experiencing and feel listened to and valued. Each programme consisted of 3 in-school workshops and a celebration event. And this is pictures from the celebration event. The first workshop always started with just one open question. What are your experiences of growing up as a girl in the northeast of England? Working together in groups, the girls then decided what they want to focus on and how they wanted to express this to others. The workshop culminated in a celebration event in which the girls presented the work they had created to family, friends, and invited guests. We did not assume in advance what was important to girls, but rather valued them as experts in their own life, respecting their critical capacities. And this was a fundamentally anthropological ethos, that we shouldn't assume in advance what's important to people, that we shouldn't frame people's lives from the outset in terms of problems, and that people are experts in their own lives. And it felt like a really simple premise, but as we ran 𝗘𝗂𝘂𝗰, we were surprised for the demand and the desire for the programme. We started in 2017 working with 2 schools and about 40 girls. In 2018, this doubled, and in 2019, it doubled again when we worked with 10 schools and youth groups. In these 3 years, over 300 girls participated in 𝗘𝗂𝘂𝗰 activities. And 𝗘𝗂𝘂𝘰 received overwhelmingly positive responses from the girls who took part. And following up with some participants, we found it had a lasting effect. So this is a quote from one of the participants who we followed up with 3 years after she'd taken part in 𝗘𝗂𝘂𝘰. So what we came to understand was that for the young people we worked with, experience of being valued and listened to were rare in school. This experience taught me that as anthropologists, we shouldn't underestimate the power that cutting against the grain of conventional education and that the creation of alternative spaces in the classroom can have. So in conclusion, there is often strange and notable contradictions between what we know and have experienced as anthropologists through our research and how anthropological university education continues to proceed. But also we know that around the world, anthropologists are questioning these implicit assumptions, conventional ways of doing things, and seeking to do otherwise in their educational practices. And it was one of the aims of ASA 2022 to provide a forum for these practices to be shared beyond institutions. And one of the great pleasures of the conference was to hear accounts of the regenerative practices of anthropological education that are happening across diverse settings and in small spaces carved out within the demands and expectations of neoliberal institutions. And again, this RAI Anthropological and Education Conference is another fantastic opportunity to hear from more people about the practices that they're doing. So Elsayed and Tim will be sharing some examples of these alternative educational practices from their studios. But first, I'll pass on to Caroline.
Hey. Thank you, Sarah, and thank all of you for coming. I'm so excited that I'm sort of shaking, and I think in a way that's I would like to invite a little bit of that childish excitement to come to all of us, right? Because we are tired, but it's great to be here together. And the thing I'd like to start off with is that in the US, many anthropologists are starting off their talks or signing their emails with acknowledgements that the universities where they're based are located on unceded Native American lands. So I would like to start with a similar acknowledgement for where we are today, but it's works in progress. So if anyone has improvements to suggest, I'd be extremely grateful. So I would like to acknowledge that modern England owes its current form of existence to ongoing extractive and neo-colonial relations around the world. The rights of the peoples colonized by this country to live and work freely here and to participate in the determination of its future remain unceded. Now, I'm sure many of you might feel the same sort of confusion that I have felt as I was growing up in my anthropological career. And to me, this was that despite long and sustained debates about where fieldwork is located, that it's not a bounded location and that it's actually co-produced by all the relationships that we engage in as anthropologists, there still seems to be a split between the stuff that we do in this fieldwork and the stuff that we do in places like universities. And the particular split seems to be how much we question our epistemological and ontological assumptions. So for example, well, there are wires all over here. So in fieldwork, it's routine to question what our epistemic and ontological assumptions are as they are embedded in our methods, in our practices, right, what we do. But then within those sort of methods and practices and stuff that we do on a daily basis within universities, this routine epistemic questioning and ontologic even more is almost, in my experience, not so present at all. Let me try and soften it a little, right? Especially not in dominant anthropologies, I should say. So what I've been trying to do over the past many years now is how can I teach anthropology, which is about different ways of knowing and being, through different ways of knowing, and doing so in ways which are respectful and appropriate. And the question which drives this frustration and wish to do something different is, what ways of knowing are considered epistemically valid for the scholarly practice of anthropology? And more specifically for this conference, what ways of knowing are considered epistemically valid for anthropological educational practices? Now, as Sarah mentioned, Tim in a moment will talk about, if you're still going to do that, I'm not sure. Well, maybe Tim will tell you a bit about the studio we convened for the last, for the ASA conference. So I will steal this opportunity to talk about my approach. And I hope that this, what I will offer you will invite a discussion about the sorts of practices that we do in places like this, which we consider academic, and which from a point of view of epistemic coloniality consecrate the sorts of knowledge that then go on to oppress and delegitimize other ways of knowing. So, since I'm talking about practices, I'm going to invite you to try a practice. Now, I'll step away from here. Can you still hear me? Because I've swapped mics. So I am going to invite you to do a task. Is it too loud? Are you okay? I'm going to invite you to do a task which is called the sphere, and it's from a type of theatre called laboratory theatre, which I did in parallel with my anthropology studies. And the aim of this task is to open up our perceptual relations with the world. How may I explore how I can know the world in a way that either I want to deepen something or explore other possibilities? And we often use it to introduce people to this laboratory theatre way of exploring the world. And so this task is something that you can very well do sitting down. Now I have to say something else first. So I will invite you to go a bit out of your comfort zones, not only because I'm going to ask you to stand up if you can, but I'm also going to ask you to go a bit out of your comfort zones of where we move. But please exercise self-care, both physically and emotionally. You don't want to pull a muscle while we're here or not pay attention to an emotion that's speaking to you. And as I mentioned, you can do this sitting down, but if you want to stand up, please feel free. And if you do stand up, place your feet in a way which you won't lose your balance too easily. And it doesn't matter if you can't see me. It doesn't matter if you can't hear me. Just do what you feel if you can't hear or see and catch something. So we're going to start by rubbing our skin and our muscles and checking out what needs extra care today, what's really excited and raring to move, right? And see, where am I, where am I right now? Right? And then remembering to breathe, because I always forget when I'm excited. Now I'm going to ask you to explore your sphere. Now, I know you've got very little space and people all around you, but you can either weave in between each other, or else maybe don't use your hands, maybe even just use your body to explore how much air around you can I reach. And while you're doing that, maybe remember that I at least spend so much time focusing this part of my torso: computers, TV, books. And you notice books came after TV, oops. But what about behind us, right? What can I feel the back of my head? Can I feel my neck stretching back? Can I reach all the way down, right? Or through my legs, right? I don't know. Be careful not to hurt yourselves, right? Yeah? Okay. I ask you now to try to soften your attention a little bit and try to see if you can feel your skin as the one organ that it is, right? So can I feel the back of my head and my chest at the same time, and maybe an arm? Yeah. And now just collect yourselves for a moment, check in again. Are those achy bits okay? Where have you warmed up? I'm sweating, but okay. Thank you so much for trying this. I'm really amazed. Well done, well done. And so I need to switch this off. So actually, you know, so we've been doing a practice where it's actually quite nice, right? We're taking care of ourselves, we're warm, we're completely safe in this place. But what I need to emphasize is that practices are anything but neutral or innocent. And I'd like to tell you a story that I read in a book called Hungry Listening by Indigenous Sound Studies scholar Dylan Robinson, who is a First Nation from Canada, Indigenous Studies scholar from Canada. And in this book, he tells of a land claim court case in Canada in 1985. And for those of you who don't know, a land claim court case is where a tribal and First Nations tribal councils take the Canadian state to court and try to reclaim sovereignty over their territories that had been usurped. Now, in this 1985 court case, the lawyers who were defending the tribal council asked Mary Johnson, who is a Gitxsan hereditary chief, to sing a dirge. And this song was part of her ancient, formal, and collectively owned oral history. Now, at first, the judge was, why does she have to sing it in court? Why can't we just write down the words and she'll sign her name at the end to say, you know, this is the correct information? But they insisted, no, she actually, it's the singing that's what counts, not just the content. And he accepted. But in his public statements, the judge said that he thought that they were trying to win him over with the beauty of the song. So he could only hear the aesthetics of the song. Now, Dylan Robinson explains that in Mary Gitxsan and many First Nations ontologies, these songs are living and legal documents. They not only portray or talk about the relationship between First Nations and the land, but they embody and keep it going, they sustain it. And in the court case, another First Nations elder, his name was James Morrison from the 𝗙𝗱𝘂𝗰 nation, he spoke, and I'd like to read what he said. He said, I can feel it, the song, right? I can feel it. I can hear the brook, I can hear the river runs, the air of the mountains. I can feel it today. It memories back to the past thousands of years of what's happened in the territory. Now, the judge could not hear or feel that song in any way similar to how James Morrison did. And what Dylan Robinson argues is that through many very violent actions, the Canadian state imposed something called normative perception through, for example, confining people to reservations, banning the potlatches, and of course, the residential schools that we heard about from Dr. Williams yesterday, right? And his argument is that by preventing people from engaging with practices on the land, they actually forcibly tried to change people's perception of the world. And this is why the judge, who embodied that normative perception, could not hear the song as a legal living document. Now, I'm coming to the end of my slot, and I would like to invite you to try one more thing that we don't normally do in plenaries like this. I'd like to invite you to sing very quietly yourselves. And the reason for this is because in many of the classrooms, in many of the conferences that we work in, the ideology of language that still is very dominant, and here it's very important for me to say that it's not language per se. We heard from Dr. Williams that language is essential in revitalization projects, but a particular ideology of language in which the only thing that carries knowledge is the conceptual or the informational bits. All the multiple other possibilities of language are simply cut off and not considered knowledge bearing. Oh, yeah. So I would like to invite you to sing where you are, very quietly so that you can feel comfortable with this, right? I know some of you might love singing, others might be like, in a conference, but it's anyway. But I invite you to try and sing. You can close your eyes, any song that comes to you, and you could see, how does it feel for me to be singing here? Or you could do that and listen to how your voices thread in with the others, right?
Okay, thank you for being here. I'm also happy to be here. I won't make you stand up, don't worry. But also I can't promise you a more interesting presentation like Caroline. So let's see. Yeah. Okay. Decolonizing the Academy Studio provided a space for critically engaging the growing calls to decolonize the academy, the university, and anthropology, among other things. We, the conveners, want to suggest via the question mark that the term decolonization requires unpacking and examination. The studio thus explored how decolonization of the academy is introduced, articulated, and achieved. That is, how decolonization is put into the world, within and beyond academia. The goal was to direct our attention to critically examine the concept of decolonization, starting from an ethnographic orientation toward the concept. Putting decolonization in the world, or seeing how others embrace it in their worlds, we, conveners and participants, discussed alternative ways for thinking about the university and hegemonic modes of representations. How to think about education beyond the walls of the university. Which forms of knowledge are allowed and fostered within the domains of Western universities? How is epistemic violence is perpetuated in our everyday life in ways of self-cultivation and recognizing the limits of one's own world? Which pedagogical initiatives work with these concerns? These were some of our guiding questions. Accordingly, we didn't start from we didn't start with decolonization as a priori or as a single thing recipe. What occupied us more was how the different faces of decolonization are put in the world, within and beyond the academia, by people coming from different backgrounds. We began with the provocative statement that the term decolonization promises more than it can deliver, because the world we have inherited is a product of colonial rule, categories, and epistemologies. Very little in the former colonies and in the metropolis has been left untouched by colonization. Decolonization therefore implies the recognition of the historical legacies of colonization and the attempts which reckon with these legacies to create more livable worlds. In other words, the question then becomes, how do we engage ongoing coloniality and find other that imagine and enact different, how do we engage ongoing coloniality and find otherwise that imagine and enact different presents and futures? What kinds of projects of epistemological and epistemic justice are required in such ethical attempts? How can we do so in educational spaces that we occupy? We identified two concepts to think with that we thought could replace, or if that's too radical, sit alongside or do some of the heavy lifting in place of or alongside decolonization. The first is Membe's term, the disenclosure of the world. The second is the concept of worlding by Spivak and reworked by a number of scholars. First, Membe argues that it makes little sense to talk about a recovery of the past in relation to once colonized population and spaces. Too much has been destroyed, life worlds, knowledges, structure of governance, etc. Too much has been extracted as well, including artifacts whose original purposes and meanings may never be recovered. And we are a few minutes away from the British Museum. He suggests it's better to focus on asking how we can build a different world that is more livable and equitable, which for him, that's the philosophical aim of decolonization and of most of the anti-colonial movements. In other words, this enclosure for Membe, following Fanon, is a pedagogy in and of itself, an unfolding processes of self-ownership and self-creation, a project of recentering, a struggle for life, a return to life, the opening of the world, a humanity yet to come, a thought of a dream, among others. Secondly, worlding, additionally, has a different heritage, rooted originally, according to Spivak, in the ways in which the natives' being in the world is fundamentally reshaped and changed when subjugated to the gaze and ordering practices of the colonizer, whom he learns to understand not only as his master, but also as someone able to exercise mastery over his world. Worlding creates worlds and mediates one's relations with their own world. Therefore, central to our understanding of worlding and this enclosure then is lifting closures, creating openings, imagining and shaping alternatives to current ways of being in and knowing the world. Putting these two concepts together, we aim to ask collectively how we, as anthropologists based in academic settings, can generate forms of worlding and disenclosure that might, if not fully decolonize, move beyond the forms of exclusion, physical, epistemological, etc., in academia, as an attempt to put hold into decolonization. Throughout our studio, we invited a visual artist to offer us her perspective on how our discussion might be expressed in drawings and illustrations. In essence, we also wanted to emphasize the importance of experimenting with other modes of expression beyond the verbal and written domains, attempting to expand our representations of the world. I would like to draw attention to some of the examples of the contribution that will be featured in our section at the upcoming ASA monograph. Through her fieldwork with indigenous academics in Brazil and their experience in universities, Marinelli proposes us an analytical and emotional exercise to not limit decoloniality to the level of conceptualization, avoiding another concept added to academic disciplines. Rather, she shows how decoloniality for indigenous academics is a political project that aims to shrink effects of decoloniality in spheres of knowledge productions. In Brazilian universities, indigenous scholars expand the common ways of knowing and established educational programs to prepare indigenous future teachers. As a result, there has been a growing rate of indigenous students entering Brazilian universities. More than an abstract theoretical concept, decoloniality for indigenous scholars, as her case study shows, is a praxis, a way of living and re-existing beyond coloniality, bodily and collectively. Another example is provided by Michelangelo, who's among our audience now. Based on his experiences in working on various tasks with the decolonization group at the London School of Hygiene, Michelangelo shows that the organization's structural connection with the colonial office in West and East Africa and India, and the methodological and ethical issues emerging from the paradoxical history and its online transition, with the technological opening of library services represented this enclosuring act. Michelangelo shows that the entanglements and disentanglements with London libraries, surviving structures and bases of coloniality, is still at work. This effort includes decentralizing sources and resources of the libraries in terms of the way they are collected, processed, categorized, and disseminated as public knowledge. In his case, to decolonize then refers to a paradigm shift from a culture of exclusion and denial and engaging in a project of restructuring to make possible the emergence of other political philosophies and knowledge systems. It's also an invitation to think more widely what it is common knowledge and the invisible legacy they might conceal, unearthing silence and deleted records in archived meeting minutes, letters, reports, and departmental collections are decolonizing examples, among others, according to Michelangelo. Last but not least, Smith starts by the question, can we talk about this enclosure if the thing that is enclosed is not recognized as such? Through ethnographic ethnofiction, Smith walks us through the story of a lecturer named Jonathan, who reflects on his interaction with his students. Reading her piece, we sympathize with the teacher, Jonathan, who is often preoccupied with his wish to be a good teacher through constant reflections and questionings of his teaching methods and intentions, and also his students' experiences. Smith, who herself is a lecturer in the Netherlands, show that in the practice of engaged pedagogy, is not only students who grow and decolonize their commonly held assumption, but teachers as well. We see that Jonathan's preoccupation comes first as an intuitive awareness, which might actualize a critical consciousness as its own byproduct. This conscious questioning of what recedes from the view, however, emerges in mundane classroom awkward and uneasy interactions. Jonathan's constant reflection on the classroom dynamics and his desire to be a good teacher is a move between openings and closure, and which shows this enclosure as an infinite and worldings as multiple. That being said, it's necessary to briefly unpack the notion of the world in relation to education and the classroom. We use the world variously as a noun and as a verb, the world and to world. If we think of the classroom as a world of its own, that evolves in dialogue, which evolves in dialogue with the world beyond itself, then the question of worlding classrooms is inseparable from the question of how we world our own worlds. In thinking of education as a liberatory practice, 𝗙𝗿𝘂𝗃 shows that the classroom is a conjuncture in which social and political issues come together to enable transgression against and beyond boundaries. The classroom is a political space, a microcosm of the world. Or for me personally, as an international student in the UK, it is a world and it is not at the same time. The point is the false dichotomy between the world outside and the inside world of the academy disappears, according to 𝗙𝗃𝘂. Since we talk about classrooms as a political space, the boundaries and relations between university and non-university spaces are fluid, and the challenge rather is to show how these spaces bleed into one another and the non-linear links in between. Worlding helps us to believe that the worlds we nurtured in the classroom leak out in the world. We presented in our studio how concerns on decolonization take place in online education by Exiles group, in university, at high schools, and in collaborative workshops between researchers. These multiple empirical sites of where decolonization require us to find creative methodological ways to detect, listen to, and follow these processes. Before I end, I would like to add 2 quick points for further reflections that I was preoccupied with before starting and during our studio. Since we showed how the questions that remains are of who and where. Who carries the burden of decolonization? The decolonization of the academy, particularly. Who shares it? Upon whom exactly it befalls? Since decolonization is often misplaced or it has been subverted historically by anti-colonial, then turned into nationalist and often semi-totalitarian regimes, like in Egypt, my country, we need to be reminded of the labor of decolonizing. We need to be reminded of the labor of decolonizing, that it befalls on all of us. It has a differential responsibility of all of us, especially as educators. Decolonizing teaching and learning and knowledge production is not a burden to be taken by global South scholars, either in their countries of origins or the institution they form in European and North American cities. It shall not be implicit in calls for decolonizing that only one group of scholars are expected to do their double task of unlearning coloniality and learning decoloniality. Since the burden of decolonization ceased to be irrelevant in contemporary world, it is a question for further reflection for each educator to ask what part they share in this task. The question of where then becomes of highly importance, since we are talking about the academy from where we speak when we aspire to decolonize. This can be both speaking from a physical being in an institutional place, acknowledging the historical relation that shaped this institution, and or speaking from the nowhere, yet everywhere of ideas, especially ideas that travel. If academics call for decolonizing, to what degrees the institutions they occupy shall acknowledge this task? And to what extent our commitment to our institutional affiliations shape our commitments to the world, that is, worldings. I am mentioning these 2 points with a pinch of salt because I used to be very cynical about the question of decolonization, although I grew up thinking about it all the time, simply because if you ask any international PhD candidate here in the UK how much they had to pay to get a visa to come here or to stand where I stand, that cynicalism appears. Especially given into account that providing accessible and common knowledge might encapsulate the labor of decolonizing. So basically, it's an invitation to think about some taken for granted ideas of who and where, whenever the decolonization is mentioned in front of us. I think this will bring alive many elephants in the room. Only then reverberation of the spectral presence of decolonization and decolonizing the academy particularly will take the front. And finally, as a little note of optimism, I would like to end with another illustration that was a product of our discussions in the studio. What I really like about this piece is its openness. It showed that some of us might share some of these experiences altogether, while other experiences might be the majority. While we can be experiencing bits and pieces of it all, but also for sure, some of us have only one dimension of these experiences, either drawn into it, stuck into it, or blinded by it. These experiences become hegemonic in their own histories and the persons they become. Thank you.
Try just a moment. No. That. Wow, works. Okay. I was just putting up some drawings in for our first studio on anthropology as education. We asked the anthropologist and artist Aina Azevedo from Brazil to draw what we were doing. It was all online, so it was a bit artificial, but she could draw what we were doing as we proceeded. And she did many more drawings than we've got here. If this works, it will just scroll through as I talk. If it doesn't, I'll have to press some buttons, but it seems to be working. So just let those run as I talk. So education is the art of leading life. It lies in the difference between leading life and living it, or between life lived as a story and life bound to the cycles of nature, or in the terms of Hannah Arendt, between bios and zoe, a distinction that, of course, goes back to Aristotle. The word education, after all, comes from the Latin ex, meaning out, and ducere, to lead. To educate is to lead out. But we are not alone in this. To lead life is also to go along with others, to follow in the ways of those who went before, and to be followed in turn by those coming after. And it's thanks to this overlap and collaboration of generations as they go along together that life can carry on. Well, education, as John Dewey put it, is the means to the continuity of life. So in the first studio, we're going a bit in reverse here. We were the first and Elsayed was the second. In the first studio, called Anthropology as Education, we were determined to start off with this expansive view of education as something fundamental to the human life process in all its forms. As Lorna Williams said in closing her lecture yesterday evening, we are all human. And in both the being and the becoming of our humanness, we're all bound up in the doing, undergoing of education. Moreover, insofar as our discipline of anthropology is an inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of human being and becoming in this world of relations in which we all find ourselves, then the study of anthropology and the study of education must be inseparable. They might almost be said to be one and the same. But to establish this congruence between anthropology and education also means challenging a certain orthodoxy and orthopraxy in both disciplines. On the side of education, it means overthrowing the traditional model of pedagogy, according to which education is the engine of social and intellectual progress. It's the task of the pedagogue in this model to instill the voice of reason and its achievements in the form of a body of authorized knowledge into every new generation, allowing it to stand on the shoulders of predecessors. But an education that truly leads out into the world, an education that is committed not to progress, but to the continuity of life, is one where generations work together, combining the curiosity of the young with the wisdom of their elders in forging a future that is common to all. And on the side of anthropology, this means challenging the standard academic model of knowledge production, in which the objective is to gather data about other people or things going on in the world, and to write it up into products that can be subjected to systematic comparison and theoretical analysis. So an anthropology that is truly educative is one that works with people in exploring the conditions of life in ways that are potentially transformative for both us and them. And it's in this sense that I believe, and this is my personal belief, not shared by everybody, that we should substitute the E of education for the E of ethnography. Anthropology is not fundamentally an ethnographic enterprise. It is fundamentally an educational one. That's my pitch. And one way of expressing the shift required of both disciplines, anthropology and education, is in terms of a change of posture from an academic posture in which teacher and students, or anthropologist and the people with whom he or she works, confront one another face to face, to what I call a posture of companionship, in which they face in the same direction, carrying on along the same ways. So the posture of companionship is a way of going along together in difference, meeting other ways of knowing and being on their own terms, and being transformed in the process. The voice of reason purports, or has always purported, to be universal, transcending all differentials of experience. That is the academic voice. Companionship, by contrast, is committed to the pluriversal. This doesn't mean, as is often supposed, a plurality of worlds. Pluriverse was a concept introduced by William James over a century ago, and he meant by pluriverse one world of nevertheless infinite difference. And this is the world we all inhabit, and whose continuity in education is at stake. So in the posture of companionship, the people of each generation, as they follow in the ways of their ancestors, lean over those of the next, so as to create a space of nurturance and growth. And this leaning over where you're moving this way, following the ways of ancestors, but leaning over the ways who are people who are following, this leaning over is an expression of love. And this idea that education in the companionship mode is inspired by epistemic love was much discussed in our studio. We must love the world, as Hannah Arendt said, if we are to introduce new people into it. Why can't love go to university? As one of our studio contributors, Laetitia Nagao, asked, or why can't it blossom in fieldwork? Or, as Arendt asked, Do we love the world enough to take responsibility for introducing new people into it? Because only if we do is there hope for generations to come. Now, a contribution to our studio, a joint contribution by Ricardo Nemirovsky, Mary Crabb, and Stephanie Bunn, focusing, among other things, on the arts of basketry, making polyhedra from nets and paper folding, vividly demonstrated to us what it means to do mathematics with love. Here's a discipline, a quite austere discipline, as it's usually understood, a discipline traditionally associated with the pinnacle of pure reason in its most abstract form, but taken in a quite different way, through collaboration in hands-on practices involving immediate engagement with materials. How to make a perfectly straight line? Simple. Fold a sheet of paper. In doing mathematics with love, as Nemirovsky, Crabb, and Bunn show, life, beauty, and knowledge all come together as one. And perhaps you could take another example from another of our contributors, Lydia Arantes, who compares what needles and threads do or are doing on the top side of a work of embroidery. That's the side we normally see, and what's going on underneath. Because on the top, the threads conform to a design, but underneath, there's a riot of conversation. You find the same thing if you look at the scribbles and cartoons that Renaissance artists put on the back of their canvases. These are canvases that have become, in the art historical canon, your masterpieces of Western art. Often of religious paintings from the Renaissance. You look on the back and you find that they're full of all kinds of scribbles and doodles and interesting commentaries and pictures of the commissioner of the work with a long nose and things like that. So they were doing it behind the scene in their canvases. So one of the themes we discussed a lot in our studio, and to which I've already referred, is how curiosity and wisdom go along together in education. And a beautiful example of this was in 𝗙𝗵𝘂𝗰𝗁's experimental theatre work with toddlers, really small children, pre-verbal. And he shows how education in this theatrical context doesn't oppose the real to the imaginary, but nourishes a kind of perception and imagination that taps into the becoming of things, in which the real is forever on the verge of becoming what it never was. And this is to participate from the inside in the world's worlding, in its continuous birth or coming into being. We've already heard from Elsayed about worlding, as used by Spivak. Rather embarrassingly, the term was also used by Heidegger, I think before Spivak, and perhaps that's a precedent that we would prefer not to acknowledge. But Heidegger also spoke about the worlding world in its continuous birth or coming into being. And in another contribution, Anne Douglas and her colleagues, including Caroline here, and Deb Pinniger and Paolo Macagno, do the same with experiments in absurdist art, compared to Marcel Duchamp's famous work, 3 Standard Stoppages. In this work, you're probably familiar with it. He took a length of string exactly measured at 1 meter and simply dropped it, and then preserved the form in which this meter had dropped. And in a way, it's a work that helps move us out of the bureaucratic educational system that stultifies curiosity and imagination. And it encourages us to follow things, to go along with them, rather than to cover them with a grid of standardized measures. And that was Duchamp's point. The string meter is still a meter, but the only way you can find its meterness is by following it along rather than measuring it up. And in our studio, Angela Zhang also taught us how wisdom and curiosity go together in another kind of setting, maybe that we don't normally consider educational because it's at the end of life, that is in a nursing home, where she, the anthropologist, working in the home as a carer, was the curious one, and the elderly residents, technically deemed to be suffering from various degrees of dementia, were the people who were wise. And walking together with the residents continually raised the question, so who is the carer now? Just as with two persons holding hands, where the hand of each holds the other, to care is also to be cared for. And this reciprocity is what it means to be at home in the nursing home. And it's also why when young people and their elders go along together in education, it is transformative for both. Well, and key to many of our discussions, or also following 𝗕𝗰𝘂𝗵's theatre work with toddlers, was the performative dimension of education. As Paula Esposito and Ben Taylor Green showed in their contribution, which was based on their experience of teaching a course at the University of Oxford with anthropology students, the performative emphasis and the opportunity it offers to get to know things from the inside, from within, in the experience, is common to anthropological fieldwork by participant observation and to an education that rests on the same principles. Or as another participant, Johannes 𝗕𝗱𝘂𝗰, also pointed out, dialogical learning processes enacted in performance are equally characteristic of education and fieldwork. It's a way of learning from each other in a collective educational experience that goes way beyond conventional ethnographic observation. The architect Alberto Altes called it intravention. It's a concept that was taken up by Esther Gisbert Alamani, Thomas Sandes Criado, and Enrique Nieto Fernandez in their contribution. They also pick up on this concept in their work on architectural education. For them, intravention is a way of changing things from the inside, of studying with, of correspondence. And yet in this, they recognize the fundamental disparity, indeed incommensurability, between academic knowledge and the knowledge brought in by students. It's not that the students presented a coherent alternative, rather they brought with them practices of knowing that call for a quite different way of relating to the world. And of course, this same incommensurability arises in the encounter, or has historically arisen in the encounter, between indigenous ways of knowing and the formal educational structures of the academy. And that's been a theme that's been widely discussed in anthropology and is, of course, one of the central themes of this present conference. But it also came into our studio discussions, especially in contributions by 𝗕𝗰𝘂𝗰 Anastasakis, who's here, and Elizabeth Rahman. Anastasakis told us about how she had invited indigenous practitioners, artists from Brazilian Amazon to work with her students at the design school in Rio de Janeiro, and Rahman about incorporating indigenous perspectives into a teacher training program. But the fundamental issue still remains, is it possible to rebalance education with a greater emphasis on indigenous or minority ways of knowing without completely restructuring the frameworks of education itself? And it's here that the discussions on our studio began to touch on those central to the second studio that Elsayed has told us about on decolonization. And they were at the heart of the contribution of Chris Wingfield to our studio. As he says, decolonial education cannot be done to others. It has to be done with them. And this means, he says, following, and I agree, following the lead of the celebrated Brazilian educationalist Paulo Freire, that the oppressors have to find a way of joining with the oppressed in finding a way forward. Otherwise, we only end up reproducing the conditions of oppression as the once oppressed become oppressors in their turn. We get caught up in a vicious cycle. And it's just the same vicious circle with the orthodox model of academic education, in which children, initially deemed to be ignorant, have to be converted into knowledgeable adults, only for them as adults to consign their own children to ignorance, and so on and on and on in the reproduction of ignorance generation after generation. And what this fuels, this cycle fuels, is a loss of love for the world, amor mundi. And I think this loss of love for the world is indeed the tragedy of our times. So just finally, to return to the theme of indigeneity, I'd like to conclude by returning to a point that was powerfully made by Lorna Williams in her lecture last night, and has actually come up once or twice in the contributions you've just heard. And that was that the future of indigenous peoples is not a question confined to small residual nations in remote pockets of the world. It's a question for all of us in this planet. And it's a question of the possibility of the continuity of our world as a pluriverse. And at this very moment, as we speak, rampant techno-capitalism is driving an aggressive model of artificial intelligence that claims to make all the languages of the world intertranslatable at the touch of a button. It claims to be in favor of linguistic diversity because it says we can have all our languages and still be able to translate them, no trouble at all. But this artificial intelligence is based on large language models that divorce words from life and from the land and reduces them to the liquid currency of a global information economy. This will be the death of both anthropology and education, and we need to act before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone. So it's 6 o'clock now. Taking seriously that lots of people are tired, we can end now. Or if people want to go and some people want to stay, we can have some questions. We can have a look at the results. It's up to the audience. But in the meantime, while we're deciding, we can have a look at the results. How long? Yeah, not long. Yeah, we all are tired. That's just from now. So these are just the results of what you answered to the survey. That lots of people, over half of people had an opportunity to share their research often, but only 22% of people have had a chance to share their teaching practices beyond their institution, and 50% rarely, and 13% never. And finally, the majority of people spend most of their working time in the practices of teaching. So if there's one thing I think we should take away from this conference and take with us, is that we just need to talk more about teaching and learning and our practices, and share more about the amazing things that we're doing with our teaching and with our education. So I think we can end there. I think it's time to again acknowledge that it's been a long day, and if anyone wants to stay and ask us questions, we're happy to answer them. And also, any comments you've put or any questions, we can feed those forward as we develop the volume for this ASA conference. So thank you, everyone.
Can I close it?
Yeah, good. Yeah. And it's fine.